This video is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon. For a year in Toronto, we lived in a non-profit housing co-op. It was great. Cheap rent, good location, but it was just a one-year sublet from a friend temporarily living abroad. We joined the waitlist for a permanent spot, obviously, but when they called back a few years later, we'd already moved to Montreal. This video is about left-wing NIMBYism, not in my backyard opposition to new housing that appeals to language of affordability and inclusivity, or skepticism of markets and capitalism. The basic idea is that market-rate housing, especially expensive new builds, doesn't help the housing crisis and might even hurt. Real affordability comes from social or nonprofit housing, mandating affordability in private projects, and rent control on existing units. Overpriced apartments no one can afford won't fix the housing crisis, they'll make it worse.
Building more expensive apartments is not going to solve the issue for the housing crisis.
Left NIMBYism can be contrasted with right-wing NIMBYism, which is about things like maintaining property values and keeping out undesirables, like this absolutely deranged opposition to a fourplex in Toronto. This will begin a cascade of more houses destroying the neighborhood into a slum yard of undesirable inhabitants, who will bring crime, filth, drug activity, and illegal aliens. A more fleshed-out example of left NIMBYism is the article, The Supply and Demand Myth of Housing, which claims that what we build and for whom matters much more than how much we build. It argues that prices are mainly driven by commodification, which they seem to mean whether housing is for profit versus off the market, with supply being at best a secondary factor. To be clear, supporting social or nonprofit housing is not itself NIMBYism. What's NIMBY is when this is unnecessarily paired with opposing or dismissing market-rate housing. No condos in my neighborhood.
Dozens of advocates voiced their concerns on a piece of land slated to become a large condo project in Mercier, Hochelaga, Maisonneuve, which he says adds pressure to an already fragile situation.
The idea that building housing somehow adds pressure to the housing market, rather than taking pressure off, that's a not-in-my-backyard anti-housing attitude. The article makes mistakes, like debunking supply and demand by saying that Calgary had faster rent growth than Edmonton despite similar vacancy rates. But the report it cites from Canada's Federal Housing Authority very clearly states that more supply reduces pressure on rents. The article cherry-picks two cities recently and ignores the broader trend. Over a 25-year period, low vacancy equals high rent growth. High vacancy equals low rent growth. The article also makes a country comparison. Pause the video for details. Left NIMBYism gets amplified in the mainstream media. A CBC article quotes activists saying that Montreal's Griffintown was overrun by condos that do nothing to curb housing shortages. Claiming that housing for 25,000 people does nothing to curb housing shortages, just because most of it is market rate, is plainly and clearly absurd. At its core, left NIMBYism misunderstands prices. What is a price? Among other things, a price is a way to ration scarcity. If 1,000 households want 500 apartments, the price rises until only 500 are willing and able to pay. Usually the wealthiest, although it's possible for others to stretch their budgets and compete if they really want to live there. The other 500? Some will end up in a different neighborhood or city. Others will stay with friends or family. The most vulnerable will go homeless. People focus on homelessness because it's the most visible and extreme outcome, but the housing shortage is much bigger. Now imagine that 200 of those apartments are taken off the market and rented cheaply so that anyone can afford them. Great, but how do you decide who gets to live there? At our Toronto co-op, the answer was a waitlist. Units didn't go to the highest bidder, but rather to whoever had waited the longest, and also made it through an interview process, I think. If you got a spot, it was amazing. Half the price of nearby rentals because it was built in the 80s and the mortgage was paid off. But planning your life around maybe we'll have an apartment for you in a few years is really, really tough. By the time they called, we'd already moved away to another city. By the way, in Canada, co-ops usually mean nonprofit rental housing, not the ownership model that you buy into like in New York City. Most were built in the 70s and 80s with government support. You can also allocate below-market housing by lottery or by connections. That's how we got our co-op sublet, knowing someone in the co-op who was traveling for a year. It's also by knowing people that you can transfer or inherit old rent-controlled units in many cities. You also hear about mandated affordable units and new projects going to developers' friends or family. Another option is discrimination. Sometimes it's sympathetic, prioritizing people in need. Low-income tenants, terminally ill people, victims of domestic abuse. But it can also be harmful, like a Montreal co-op accused of rejecting a single mother because they wanted a traditional family. Discrimination in housing is much easier when you have a lot of applicants for one place. Finally, below-market housing can be allocated by bribery. In New York City, people can pay illegal key money to get rent-stabilized apartments. In a famous case, a journalist paid $24,000 in 1980 to move into a permanently cheap apartment in this building in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Left NIMBYism treats prices as a trick, a mirage of capitalism, rather than a reflection of an underlying material reality. If we can just take a hammer and smash those prices down, we've fixed the problem. But unless you fix the underlying supply imbalance, all you've done is replace high prices with long waitlists, lotteries, bribery, or needing to know the right person. And some people will still be excluded. The article was wrong to deny that market supply is a major determinant of prices, directly contradicted by its own citation. But it's correct that taking housing off the market can help affordability. Almost by definition, below-market prices are below the market prices, whether rented out at cost or subsidized below cost. But will it be accessible? Can you easily get an apartment if you're new to the city? Or if you want to upsize or downsize for family reasons, like having kids or your kids moving out? With an average monthly rent of €750 or $900, rent-controlled apartments in Stockholm are affordable. With an average wait time of 10 years to get one, they're definitely not accessible. Here's a database of 185 nonprofit housing co-ops in Toronto. No vacancy, no vacancy, no vacancy, no vacancy. Okay, let's filter for vacancy. 0 co-ops found. Even a waitlist? 0 currently found. Why not just build a lot more nonprofit housing co-ops? Setting aside funding, you need to change zoning to allow all that housing. Not all, but a lot of left NIMBYism is tied up in not wanting too much change, height, or density, though. Vancouver is considering upzoning for more nonprofit housing, including allowing an impressive 15 to 20 stories in these purple areas by default. That would speed up projects and allow more units. I love it, but a lot of people appealed to left NIMBYism, the language of inclusion, affordability, and concern for residents of the buildings, to oppose it. That's too tall. Living above floor 6 or 8 is bad for people. It allows mixed-income projects rather than only 100% below market. It allows high ceilings, which is excessive, unaffordable, and adds up to make the buildings too tall. Our Toronto co-op was a high-rise though, and no one in the building seemed bothered. I certainly didn't wish that it was shorter so that fewer people could live there. Much the opposite. If people didn't like it, they could just not apply to live there. Here's someone criticizing Griffintown in Montreal. I don't want to further encourage the building of $500,000 closets when we could be building 4-story plexes for reasonable rent. It sounds like you want smaller buildings with larger units and cheaper rents. Almost by definition, you won't be meeting demand. That's not abundant social housing accessible to everyone. It's cheap housing for a few, subject to my aesthetic and architectural preferences. Here's a small old apartment building in Kensington Market in Toronto. In 2019, a new owner tried to evict tenants to redevelop the property. However, a community land trust with $3 million of funding from the city bought it to maintain the 12 units as affordable housing. It was celebrated as a win. Community land trusts could help provide the affordable housing that we so desperately need. But none of the commentary that I saw covered how you get a spot here or how long the waitlist or lottery is. From digging on the website, you need to be a member of the Community Land Trust to hear about new availability. With only 12 units, though, I'm willing to bet that it's pretty hard to get a spot. This is affordable housing, but it's not accessible housing. That's not meant as a criticism of the Community Land Trust. With the resources they had, they meaningfully helped a dozen households. But if we understand market housing through its price, we need to understand non-market housing through its waitlist or other allocation mechanism. A rent price of $850 sounds super exciting, but it doesn't mean much to people if they can't actually get a spot. Imagine that we could turn all of Kensington Market, 2,000 homes, into nonprofit housing under a community land trust. I'm willing to bet there'd still be a huge waitlist because Toronto fundamentally has a housing shortage and shifting housing off the market doesn't change that. If you want a short waitlist, you need to build a lot more housing here. But one of the Community Land Trust's goals is maintenance of the historical built form of Kensington. So I'm not sure they'd support the level of construction required to build housing for everyone who wants to live here. You can think of left NIMBYism as a single-minded focus on price. New market rate housing is bad because it's expensive, ignoring how it takes pressure off older housing. Social housing is good because it's cheap, ignoring the often years-long waitlists or lotteries. My basic worry is that left NIMBYism creates a two-tiered housing system. The small amount of market housing you allow serves only the rich, and then some lucky low-income people get cheap apartments they can't give up or move away from. Everyone else, including the middle class, gets squeezed, but you don't necessarily notice because you've hidden the shortage behind long wait lists instead of high prices. Fundamentally, the only way to make housing broadly affordable and accessible is to build enough of it relative to demand. That's the lens through which I judge all housing policy. It's why I'm more excited to see new social housing builds than old stock bought to be maintained as affordable housing. That's fine too. It insulates some people from the housing crisis. But new builds like this 194-unit building for low-income seniors actually materially reduce the shortage. Inclusionary zoning, mandating a certain percentage of units in private developments be affordable, is usually bad because it's like a tax on new housing that makes projects less viable. But it can work if governments are willing to provide subsidies or land. Rent control of the kind we have here in Quebec, capping big increases but exempting new buildings for 5 years, provides tenant stability without, as far as I can tell, deterring rental construction. But fundamentally, it manages the symptoms of the housing crisis, not the cause. And it's impossible to fully insulate people. If you're enjoying far below market rent, it'll be difficult to move.
What we're observing is just that people aren't moving this year. It used to be in past years, maybe your apartment was too small, maybe it wasn't in good condition. You could potentially move somewhere else under better conditions, and that's really no longer the case.
If you want people to be able to easily move, we need to bring down market prices. That requires more than just rent regulation. You need to fundamentally change supply and demand dynamics. In short, you can't rent control your way out of a housing shortage. You can't inclusionary zone your way out of a housing shortage. You can build social housing your way out of a housing shortage, although it's a lot harder to do if you oppose market rate housing because then governments or nonprofits have to fund all new housing construction instead of just some, and that's an enormous amount of money. Right-wing NIMBYism is bad, but it's legible. You don't want poor people, immigrants, or renters living near you. Gotcha. It's awful that you think it's the government's job to segregate society through housing, but at least I know what you're up to. Left-wing NIMBYism is weirder, because it claims to support affordable, inclusive cities. But by blocking market-rate housing for being too expensive, it makes housing more expensive. You can't say the market will only serve the rich when you create the conditions for that to be true. Supporting social or nonprofit housing is great, but that doesn't entail blocking other kinds. Supply and demand is not capitalist nonsense. Talk to anyone living in places with social programs. I support and appreciate subsidized daycare and universal healthcare here in Quebec, but if you have a shortage of spots or doctors, it hurts, even if it's not expressed as price. Shortages hurt no matter the system. Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and a special thanks to our supporters on Patreon.